I'm wondering if anybody can truly understand and comprehend the concept of nothing. I think that technically that is an impossibility to conceptualize what nothing is, because first of all, nothing isn't. Nothing represents the absence of everything, of all things, including the concept of nothing itself. Because if it wasn't for having a mind, if it wasn't for the presence of the mind, there would be no concept of nothing. There just simply would be nothing if nothing existed. And even to say nothing exists is an invalid statement, which I'll get to. Because really the state of nothingness is the state in which there is no thing in existence. And that includes ideas, concepts, beliefs, all these things we know to exist because people have them, people carry them, people communicate them, people consider them. Everything that we know, literally everything that we process in this universe is something. We can represent things in, as variables in an equation. But those things are things themselves. So if we were to say X is something, whatever X happens to be, we could set X to be a tree, or to be a car, or to be me, or to be a belief, or an idea. X itself is a thing. So when we consider something, we consider something. We don't consider nothing. Nothing actually cannot be considered because there is nothing there to consider in the absence of anything. So when we say X in an equation, that's an implication that X exists because X itself exists. Because X doesn't even have to represent anything. It can be X itself. So we say X, and we can compare that to some other thing called Y, perhaps. So we can compare a dog to a tree. Are these two things equal? No. X is not equal to Y. Now, because we are considering this thing, and we are writing terms to refer to this thing, we are considering things in reference to that thing. So in order to record in a way that we can interpret and understand to convey a meaning, to mean that X does not exist, we can say not X. But that's an invalid statement in and of itself. We cannot say not X and have that be valid, because if there is no X, there's no X to invert. If X does not exist, which is what not X implies or means, we can't look at X and say that doesn't exist. If X does not exist, it doesn't exist. There's no concept of it. There's no conception of it. There's no comparison to it, because the idea of it even doesn't exist, if that's the case. So we cannot say things like X is not Y. Well, we can say X is not equal to Y. X is not an instance of Y. But if we say not Y, we're saying Y does not exist. So we can't compare X to non-existence. Because when we say that something doesn't exist, that means it's absent. There is no comparison to be made. We cannot compare X to not Y, because we're comparing X to nothing in that case. So we can't even say that X is not some other thing that doesn't exist. So before 1962, I did not exist. So before that time, you could not say that I was not a car, because you can't put I in the equation, because the state of not I was the state before 1962, and not I is nothing. Not I is non-existent. There's no I to consider. So you can't say I was not a car. It's an invalid comparison. You can't even say that no cars existed prior to when they were invented. What you really mean by that is that there was no instance of a thing known as a car before the car came along. So the things that we say, the things that we convey in our language, like no car existed, or cars did not exist, let's say it that way, cars did not exist, that's an invalid statement. But we understand the meaning of that because we do know today about the existence of cars. We know, we understand, we have this idea of this thing that we know as a car in our mind that we can conceptually compare to a time that it came before that concept came along. So we can say cars did not exist prior to something. But we can't go back to then and say cars did not exist. We can say that there was no presence of this thing that we now know today to be a car, because the car concept didn't even exist. It's a difficult concept to grasp, but once you understand it, it's really very basic and simple. And it really illuminates the idea that beliefs are things. They're things, they're constructs, they're mental constructs that we hold in our minds. We can communicate them, but we can carry them. But when we form a belief about something, we have to form a belief about that. If we're considering the existence of a thing, we have to form a belief. If we're going to form a belief at all, we have to form a belief either that it does exist, or we have to form a separate belief that the thing doesn't exist. We have this concept presented to us. We don't know the validity of whether this concept applies to anything actual in reality. We are judging this idea to say, okay, I believe that the claim behind this idea of this thing actually existing is true, or it's false. But we're not saying that I believe that's false, because a belief is not a statement that something is false. A belief, by definition, is an assertion that something is true. So we cannot say, I believe that is false. You have to say, I believe the claim that this is false is true, or that the claim that this is true is true. You don't have a belief if you think that something isn't true. I mean, if you either have no belief, or you believe that a claim about something is true, or a claim about the absence of something is true. That's the only way that it can be, because otherwise the belief would have to exist before the premise. The premise is the claim being made, such as God exists, for example. Let's say the claim is God exists. You either believe that God exists is true, or believe that God exists is false, or you don't have a belief about either one yet. If before you were presented with the concept of God existing, or God period, you would not have a belief either way. there simply would not be any reason for you to believe in this God concept, because the God concept itself does not exist before it's presented to you. It does not exist in your mind, in your awareness. So you cannot have a belief that God exists. You cannot have a belief that God does not exist. You simply have no belief. There's no belief there. Once the concept is presented to you, that doesn't change you at all. The concept has nothing to do with you at all. So if somebody introduces the concept of God to you, you then can evaluate that concept to determine for yourself whether you think there's validity to the claim that this thing has any reality behind it. So you can then form a belief and say, I believe this claim that this thing is true, or I can consider that this claim is false and believe that that assertion is true. Or I can look at that and say, I don't know, I'm uncertain, I don't have enough information, nothing has given me reason to change my default state, which is a state of having no belief or consideration about this whatsoever. I can throw the whole concept out, I can ignore it, or I can continue to explore it until such time where I deem it necessary or arrive at a place where I feel I've come to a conclusion where I can form a belief about it. It is not valid to say that because I don't believe something is true, that I believe something is false. Those are two separate beliefs. Like I just said, if that were true, that I say I don't believe this claim is equivalent to saying I believe that claim is false, then if you eliminate the claim, the default position would be that I would have to already have a belief about this thing. And that just isn't the case. Anyway, enough of my rant. I just had to get this off my mind and to provide some clarification here, because there's been some argument about references to, I think it's a language thing and an interpretation of how somebody defines what exists, what existence is, what a belief is, etc., etc. And I just had to disclose my perception here, my understanding, my worldview on what seems so blatantly and obviously clear to me. But you know, we're all different, and it's interesting to see other people's perspectives. So hopefully you've got something out of this, and maybe it'll make you think of things in a different way. I'm certainly thinking about things in a different way after these discussions, so it's interesting and it's entertaining and intriguing to explore these ideas. But the more I explore these ideas that have been presented to me recently, the more I realize the more I validate my own perspective. So that's why I'm conveying this, in hopes that someone else may find it valid as well. So anyway, that's it for now. Thank you.